Welcome back! Today I will dive into the next phase of my dressing form project, creating the cover. As you may have seen in the first video, the foam surface isn't quite what I want to be it in terms of smoothness and aesthetics. To tackle this issue, I've chosen to use a layer of temperature blocking felt, commonly used in oven gloves to provide protection from heat. The result was just what I needed. The felt smooths out any lumps and bumps and creates the perfect base layer for the later fabric cover. I started with stroking and carefully pinning the felt into place. However, I soon realized that just smoothing the felt over the form would not work as well as I hoped, since I didn't know where to exactly cut, and adding the seam allowance directly on the form would make the process much easier. So I restarted at the back where I could train myself and any mistakes wouldn't be that visible. I created a fold where the seam allowance would be, doing that by pinning it as snug to the form as possible. This way I could achieve the exact pattern shapes I needed. I followed the seams typically used in block patterns or those seen on dressing forms, but also had to add some in other areas where the felt wouldn't lay as flat as I wanted. So last night I covered the whole thing with this felt-like fabric, but I stopped when I realized that when I fold over the seam allowance, it's super thick there and I don't want the thickness. So what I think I'm going to do now is to test in this little area here where I accidentally cut wrongly if I can make a butt seam and this will stay in place. Then I guess I just will cut off the seam allowance everywhere and make butt seams so that the fabric lays really flat. And yeah, that's what I'm gonna try now. So what I've learned, this is usually a seam you use for leatherworks, but I think in this case I'm really gonna use it. It just does what I wanted to do. And I go with the simpler one because I can pull the thread really flat and there's almost no seam whatsoever, no bulk I mean. After completing this first test, I focused on making the seams as flat as possible. I cut off the material I thought I would use as a seam allowance, leaving a tiny gap between each piece, which I then would pull in with the thread to achieve a smooth look. First, I used a tiny scissor since I was afraid of cutting accidentally into the felt. But soon I realized that my actual sewing scissors did a way better and precise job despite their size. I repeated this for every other seam, transferring into a sitting position for comfort as I progressed. most challenging area to sew was under the arm, near the armpit, but with some fiddling and maneuvering, I managed to sew it nonetheless. I need to show you something. I think I forgot about it and I have to fix it now. Okay, so, do you see this? These arms are completely at the wrong heights. They are not nearly equal. I haven't seen it before. So, I think what I'm going to do now is to reopen this side and shorten it. I think that's the best solution. So, let's see how much I have to shorten it. And at the back it's even worse. But I think it looks so crooked if I let it be that way. So I really want to at least level it out a little bit. Since I am crooked, my back is crooked, somewhat. You can also see this side is a little bit, or from the side, this is less pronounced than this one. And also the waistline is a little bit higher at one side than on the other. But this really looks crooked. See, and also look at this neck. That's crazy. But I think for the neck I will let it be that way, but not for the arms. I have to fix that somehow. To determine how much I need to cut off, I use the string and the bubble level to ensure a straight line, along with my eyesight for visual alignment. Let me think about it. With this guide, I proceeded to cut open the seam of the longer arm and made a cut to enable flipping the felt over and up. As I didn't have a better tool at hand, I used a kitchen knife to remove the excess foam, which turned out to be quite a bit. Afterward, I had to close the cut area once again, but I'm glad I took the extra step because it significantly improved the appearance. As I initially mentioned, I had reservations about doing the same for the neckline, but eventually I decided to open and close it as well, and I think it was a good choice to do so. The next day I began the actual process of covering the form. I used the pendulum to draw a straight line and mark where the pattern piece would be placed. I used the tailor's tape along these lines, making it easy to readjust if needed. Initially I aimed to place the seams in the same position as professional dressing forms, but I soon realized that I needed to add one above the bust line to accommodate to the rounding. For the rest, I followed the same approach as with professional forms. To create the pattern pieces, I pinned random cotton fabric, which I typically use for mock-ups, to the form and marked the lines where I would place the fabric. I made sure the fabric laid as flat as possible on the noted position. Once the pattern pieces were correctly marked, I transferred them onto the actual fabric, leaving a seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters. Additionally, I left extra material at the bottom to fold it under the form during the final steps. I I chose plain cotton poplin for the fabric, which I believed was the most suitable for the dressing form.
All the pieces required laid out where they belong, and now I'm going to pin them together.
I started by sewing together the horizontal lines first, as it was easier to close the short seams before tackling the longer ones. I ensured that each seam aligned perfectly with its corresponding piece. To secure the pieces to each other, I first used pins, but soon realized that this doesn't hold them in place as accurately as I wanted them to, therefore I basted them down using a white thread. This worked way better. I also double-checked if I was using the right pieces and compared them with the form before sewing. Then I used my antique sewing machine, which I somehow prefer to use. After sewing the pieces together, I ironed the seam allowances first to one side, then to the other, and finally open. Using my tailor Sam, I found it much easier to iron and block them in place, taking care of the rounding of the shapes. Removing the basting thread, I was pleased to see that every seam was perfect, without any need for readjustments. Usually I have to at least re-sew one or two seams, but this time not one. I knotted the threads and trimmed the seam allowance with a zigzag scissor to make the seam allowance less visible, since they don't create one straight line, and it also prevents from fraying. With the horizontal seams completed, I moved on to the longer vertical lines. While most crossing seams aligned perfectly, there were a few that weren't precisely on the millimeter. But I believe these minor mismatches won't be noticeable later on. After completing the seams, I turned my attention to pressing and blocking to eliminate any wrinkles. I found that pressing them multiple times made the seams really flat and smooth, allowing me to move on to the arms and neck, which were the most challenging parts to sew. First, I sewed on the shoulder caps, closed the entire shoulder seam, and then added the fabric for the underside of the arms. Thanks to the basting technique, this process went surprisingly well, and each piece stayed at its place. Once all the pieces were sewn together, I could finally remove the tape and cover the dressing form. Initially, I was unsure if the fit was right, and there were some wrinkles that I needed to smooth out. I suspect that the covering might be slightly wider due to sewing directly on the marking line instead of a bit inside the marking. I was afraid to make the covering too small, and therefore I made it too big. I still managed to pull the material together at the back to reduce the wrinkles. And then I used a mattress stitch, a seam that almost looks like sewn from the inside that holds the fabric neatly together. This stitch is made by catching a couple of millimeters exactly at the fold of the one side, then passing to the other side and repeating this process. Next, I worked on the bottom of the covering. I continued and completed the construction with the wooden ring screwed onto the bottom plank. This ring pushes the rubber band tightly to the tube, ensuring that the bottom won't slide down over time. I continued securing it in place by stapling the fabric to the wood, starting at the four sides and then working our way around, always making sure that the fabric was pulled tightly but not excessively. I also cut the tube to my desired length, which is my height, while wearing some slightly heeled shoes. I still noticed some wrinkles in the fabric, especially around the arms and the neckline. To fix this, I used some headless pins to pull the material upwards around the armpit area, already reducing the wrinkles. Additionally, I steamed certain areas to make them less wrinkly, which worked quite well. For the neck area, I had initially made a pattern piece that wasn't perfectly round and later reworked it and made it round, since I thought this couldn't be right. This, however, resulted in excess material. To correct this, I used the same technique as before for closing the back, by pulling the fabric in place and hiding some material in the seam allowance using a mattress stitch once again. And with that, the dressing form is now completely covered. Now let's compare it to my actual body. I must say I'm really pleased how it represents my body shape. It stands at the height I would while wearing high-heeled shoes, which I usually do when wearing costumes or skirts. And the waistline sits exactly where it should for me, and what's also really cool that I can slightly squish in this area here because the foam was softer there, and so I could, for example, tighten a corset or something. But for the rest, the upper part is really stiff, so I can pin in here and really make the draping without deforming anything. I think it's really cool for the first draft and the mock-ups to test it on the form and then later on me once the main issues have been solved. And I think it's so cool to see all the things I usually tend to see as issues with my body just represented here, and now I can deal with it. I can deal with the longer décolleté line and the high waist and also the round back I have, so I could handle that better, place the pieces better, and maybe also hide some of those roundness in some way. I don't know yet how, but I know it is possible. It's obvious that the dressing form isn't perfect, as there are still some wrinkles and I just can't get them removed. However, I don't think they bother me with the actual purpose of draping on it, and so overall I'm really pleased with how well it presents my body shape, and that's what matters most to me. Reflecting on the process, there are a few things I would do differently next time if I ever make another form. Firstly, I'd make the front and back part of the cast separately to eliminate the risk of fainting during the process. Additionally, I'd use an impregnation or a suitable removing agent like Vaseline or something oily to make the form easier to remove and possibly also reusable. This would ideally avoid the entire plaster removal process, which was time consuming and messy. So if I could avoid that, that would be great. And regarding the covering issue, so that there are still some wrinkles, I considered using a jersey fabric, but I'm not fond of the texture it gives on a dressing form. So I sticked with the woven fabric. And instead I might focus on ensuring that the pattern pieces fit even better, maybe sewing just next to the charcoal lines, as that could help making the fit slightly tighter. That is what I think, but despite the imperfections, I'm generally happy with the results. I'm excited to start my next project using this dressing form. There's a particular project I've wanted to do for a long time, but I always hesitated because I felt I couldn't do it properly on myself, adjusting the mock-ups. I'm really looking forward to sharing that project with you soon, hopefully. And I can't wait to get started. Basically, I have to start first. So if you think the whole endeavor was worth the time and effort, let me know. Give me your feedback. I think I won't make another form that soon, but your feedback means a lot to me as I continue on my journey. So see you next time. What do you think? Should I try to make this one fit like this one? I'm not sure if I can do it, but maybe it's worth a try. What do you think?